So can you see my screen?
Yes, Grady, go ahead.
One slide or two?
Two.
Two. We had that problem earlier. One slide or two?
One slide.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I appreciate the invite from John to be here today to talk to you a little bit about some sports turf issues, primarily related to performance and how they handle wear and traffic, and also some maintenance aspects. As was mentioned, I am Grady Miller from NC State University, and the primary turf we deal with in this area is Bermudagrass, much like you, but we do have some alternative grasses as well. But we're going to primarily concentrate on Bermudagrass areas and some of the construction. So the slide you see in front of you today is actually a baseball field near where I work. And in our stadiums in the US, they're being asked to do more and more outside of sports events. So sometimes we have expectations that are very high that they will perform. So in this case, they are actually covering the field to protect it from having a concert on the surface. So we are going to talk a little bit about failure when the field is not performing ideally. When I talk to field managers, they often give me a number of reasons why their field is not doing well. So this is a top 10 list I often hear from our field managers. Certainly, many of them fight construction issues and certainly overuse issues, but they also have issues associated with maintenance, whether it's trained labor, equipment, or adequate equipment, and then the resources they need to maintain the field. And then we also sometimes have storms or other situations that cause an influence on the field and may cause it to fail. And I will share with you some pictures in just a moment. In many cases, there's also a question of what to do when we have these issues. And they often are multiple issues. It's not just one. So we have a number of things that come about. So the focus today really is around this success formula, which I like to use in sports turf talks. So at the middle of the success is the proper design and construction. But around that, you have maintenance issues and use issues, which sometimes can help you overcome construction problems. Not always, but sometimes. So how you manage your water, your maintenance practices, and also the limit of use. And I'm not talking about reducing use, but just how it's used during the course of time. And that's very important. So as I said with the previous slide, a field may fail from a number of different reasons. And we often talk about combinations of these and also even secondary influences. So I'll explain that in a moment as well. So here's a picture of our university stadium. And you might notice this was taken in fall of 2009 during the football season. They had a break and they actually renovated the field the first time in many years. And they did a very good job of designing and constructing. They used appropriately sized equipment, good turf grasses, and a great deal of care in constructing this particular field. But another issue they also had is a concert, a very large stage, a very big band, and ultimately, a lot of damage to the field, which required them to do the renovation. So it also afforded them the opportunity to pay for the renovation. So once again, our use is also driving what's being done. And this was during the same month, but a few years different in the fact that despite the fact they had done a good job of building the field, because they had not maintained good cultural practices to alleviate compaction and also the buildup of organic matter, when they had a very severe hurricane storm, the field played very poorly. It retained a lot of moisture, and it was not a very good surface of which to play on. So I often like to talk about primary problems and secondary problems. And really, primary problems are the ones that are causing the issues. But oftentimes, primary problems result in secondary issues that you have to address. And the example I will use for the next few slides is surface soil compaction. So when you have a lot of wear and play on a field, you compress those macropores, and often you have a lot of negative conditions. So what comes out of that is often poor water infiltration, poor gas exchange, rooting problems. And typically these are symptoms of the primary problem, and often these are the ones that we address first. So we may not actually even try to address the primary problem because we're so concerned about these conditions that are secondary in nature. So these are often immediate. So you would tend to address these and not really take that long-term approach to minimize what originally happened. And often that may require even renovation. So one of the examples I like to show is very well depicted in the soil core. So you have a heavy soil type. This particular field was not getting good infiltration, so they capped it with sand. But unfortunately, then they put a sod on the top that had heavy soil again, like their subsurface. And once again, despite the fact they attacked a symptom, they didn't really correct the problem with the renovation. So then they began top dressing to once again build up that soil profile. So there were several mistakes made in the maintenance and care of this particular field that ultimately caused it to have a lot of secondary issues. And certainly primary or secondary issues come about. So if you have disease, turf decline, weeds, you're going to address those very quickly. In many cases, you need to go back and address that primary problem. So I tell turf managers frequently, despite the fact you have symptoms, you're getting failure or problems with your field, ask yourself what is really causing it. And while you may manage the secondary problems, at some point you need to go back and address what's causing that primary issue on your field. Now, as I have asked managers for years, what are their major problems? What are they having symptoms of or issues of? Almost invariably, wear and compaction on athletic fields are the top two. Equipment or lack of equipment or appropriate equipment is often very high. Now, we do have some fields that have great equipment. So this is not a list that everyone would use, but it is a common list, particularly at our mid-level types of fields. Drainage and irrigation. Weeds, insects, and diseases, while we have products to control these, because of that, they're often very low on our list of problems. And then certainly the cultivar species sometimes comes into play. So these are all, in many cases, issues that need to be addressed at some level, and some of these we can address very quickly, some of which we cannot. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the ideas that we've presented to field managers, in some cases even coaches, to deal with their primary problems. Certainly with wear is controlled use. And by controlled use, not continual use just because the field is open. So having practices, rotating practices, not using the field when it's very wet or very dry, but just wise use on that field. And I'll show you some additional ideas along that as well. Often fertilization can be used to promote growth. You can even fertilize just in the high wear areas more than the non-wear areas. So not necessarily maintaining the entire field the same way, but addressing those high wear areas individually. I've mentioned rotating already. We did some work many years ago looking at shoe and cleats and the damage that a cleat does to a field. So having more cleats that are smaller for athletes can go a long way. So having maybe practice cleats or bane cleats, some alternatives. And certainly cultural practices like top dressing and plant growth regulators can be used. So you see wear like this in our soccer goal mouse, and I know soccer is certainly a major sport in many areas of the world, and you've seen these kind of wear much worse in some of our fields. So having the ability to move that goal, having temporary goals, such as we see here for practices, is really important to change those wear patterns and the habits of those who are using it. Even our large goals we use in American football, we see sometimes locations where they'll put those on wheels and move them around to alleviate that wear compaction area. So just good management of the user groups, the athletes, and where they're using your facilities goes a long way on wear. I'll also reference this publication. We have turf files, which is where we put a lot of publications. And if some of you would like more information on ways to maximizing the durability, this publication can be downloaded. Some of the talking points from this presentation are coming from this publication that is available. Then there's also dual use fields. For those of you, maybe in some situations where you have a field used for multiple sports. In this picture, right along where I'm dragging my mouse, that is the American football sideline. It's not currently painted, but it will be right there. And then the soccer sideline is further back. So you can see the amount of wear this field is getting. And we've tried to encourage less and less use of these dual use fields because you can see can be quite damaging to these surfaces. So always be looking for ways to reduce wear. This is a baseball field. And you can see, we often see this high wear area in front of the pitching mound, where we get this teardrop shape, where the pitcher walks up after he throws, practices and pitches. So using surfaces and mats and other things can go a long way towards causing some of those wear patterns. The other thing that's become popular in some of our multi-use facilities is having small areas with synthetic turf to do concentrated drills. So in this particular picture where it's dark green, where the people are standing, you can do things that require very intense practice on this area, and then for less intense practice, go to the natural grass. So I see this as a very good use for a synthetic surface, just for those very repeated practices and wear, and not, being on the other surface. Some things require a little more education. In our soccer, the linesman damage, where they run back and forth. I tell people that's really a people issue. It's talking to your linesman and encouraging them to run down the line in a different pattern, moving back plus or minus a few feet. And certainly in our soccer, or your soccer, we can move the lines of the field without any issue. I mean, American football is very exact where that line must go, but soccer allows a range of field widths and dimensions. So moving this line in one direction or the other can sometimes help alleviate a problemware area. In our baseball, we often have small kids. They stand out in the outfield when they're bored, and they have cleats on and they'll dig holes. I mean, that's a coach and a parent has to help the field manager not have that issue come about. So often we have people issues in addition to field issues, but working with these players and their parents with small kids can be very important in maintaining a nice field. And then sometimes we just have problem areas. This is due to excess shade and also excess wear right in front of the dugouts. In many cases, that's going to require a lot of extra maintenance, or in some cases, we might put a synthetic surface in these areas just so that we do not see that sort of wear patterns. So these are some points brought out in the publication I mentioned earlier. And certainly there's a lot of things, and a lot of our problems with field are chronic problems. So it's not one opportunity or use, it's a combination of a lot of issues over time. So this list, in many cases, you may not do them all every time the field is used, but it certainly gives you ideas. And the more you can control the use and the people and how they use it, the better off your field will be. Just something as simple as having a fence around the field so you don't have a lot of unofficial play can be very important. You may have a park area or a recreation area for unofficial play, but for your sports teams, you may want to control that and keep that from happening. And certainly anything you can do to, change practices and move athletes around can be very beneficial for its use. The other thing I encourage people to do is to establish maximums. And I usually talk about number of hours of use. And we developed these many years ago just to provide some guidelines. And I tell people that they are just guidelines. We have some fields that can handle many more games, many more practices than these guidelines will suggest, and other fields that, these may be too generous. You may need to be even more conservative. But if you can track field usage and monitor it and develop guidelines, in many cases, you can really help your fields in maintaining, turf grass stands. So this is a good starting point, and these would be hours of use in a year, starting with good field conditions. And certainly, like I said, you can adjust these as you get data for each one of your fields that are being used. I'll talk a little bit more later in the talk about how you can actually use information like this to establish standards for fields. And that's been very effective for some of our field managers, is actually providing standards based on field use. Other things is to use signage. Just some examples that I've taken over the years. This was a field that they wanted it to recover, so they would put up a sign and they would close it for some period of time. In this case, it was for several months in the summer. Just helping to control people, letting people know you may be watching and that when they're out there, and trying to control use, or in some cases, almost vandalism type of use from our facilities. The other issue that is very challenging for a lot of field managers and facilities is the equipment they use. In many cases, the people that buy the equipment the administration, they may not have a good understanding of what your equipment needs are. So I put communication at the top. In many cases, you need to communicate to the people exactly what equipment you would need. And if you had certain pieces of equipment, what you could do with it, how it would be used, how it would benefit your facility. So certainly with turf equipment, communication with those people involved is very important. In some cases, you should also look at opportunities to lease equipment because it may be a less investment than purchasing it. I'm not sure if you have lease programs like we do, but in many cases, we have opportunities to reduce our cost by leasing the equipment rather than purchasing it. Also borrowing it. If you have multiple fields and municipalities, you may be able to trade and loan equipment to each other. And that can be very effective for some pieces of equipment that are not used very frequently. It's just loaning it out or borrowing it from another facility. And in many cases, you may even be able to fabricate some equipment. For our baseball fields, a lot of the pieces of equipment they use on our baseball fields to manage the clay areas, the infields, in many cases, field managers will fabricate that to save on cost. So let's talk a little bit about wear maintenance, and certainly you cannot talk about wear maintenance without mentioning aerification. So this is obviously a picture of a core aerifier, so it's going to make some fairly sizable holes. It's going to pull cores, and that's going to be your best way of combating excessive wear and compaction. Now, how should you aerify? And I tell people in many cases that you cannot aerify too frequently. I like to see a field aerified at least once or twice a year. It's not getting a lot of traffic. And if it's getting a lot of traffic, you may be needing to aerify 2 to 5 times a year. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean you necessarily need to aerify the entire field, 5 times. You may only aerify high wear areas 5 times, the goal mouths or the corner kick areas. And you may aerify areas that do not receive as much wear less frequently. That's one way to make your equipment last, good use of labor, and also just trying to manage your time and equipment more efficiently. So core it as often as you can, but certainly core your high wear areas, your high impact areas more frequently if you can't get over the entire surface each time. I say use hollow times when possible, but you may need to even use deeper times sometimes during the year. So we have a lot of equipment available sometimes, but some of it may not be available to you. So I tell people to use whatever you can, whatever you have available to your benefit. Here's a much deeper tine. It goes down, 10, 12 inches. Really helps to get through subsurface layering and compaction. This is the kind of equipment, at least in the US, we often contract out to have people come in and do this infrequently because this type of equipment is too expensive to own for most facilities. So contractors will then go around and use it. So utilize your industry and contractors in some cases can save you money, but also offer services to help you keep your fields in good shape. So this is a great picture that goes back to the earlier discussion on primary and secondary types of symptoms. In this particular field, it's at a university. You see a lot of what looks like wear, but this is actually disease. This is spring dead spot, which is a common disease in Bermudagrass that we see in the US. And the difference between the field and the sidelines was they were aerifying this. The sidelines were not getting aerified. So we were seeing a disease symptom from a maintenance practice or lack of a maintenance practice, to be honest. So the way they alleviated this issue is one year they actually controlled it with fungicides, but they started aerifying more of the sidelines. And ultimately, they did not have the disease appear like they did in this particular year. So by treating that cause being soil compaction, they didn't see that symptom of that disease. So very good lesson on managing a field. And then we have drainage. And certainly if you have drainage issues and they are continual, it's time to renovate. I mean, it's time to go ahead and address that drainage issue. In the next slide, I'll show you a drainage issue that field managers ignored for a long period of time when they should have addressed it very quickly. So aerification will help with drainage as well as top dressing, but it's going to be very limited, the results you will get from those management practices. And I will tell people chemical intervention using chemicals to try to increase drainage generally does not work. Wetting agents can help distribute water, but wetting agents really will not benefit drainage. This was that slide I was mentioning. This is a entry gate for the women's soccer team. And every time it rained, it would be standing in water. You know, at some point they needed to increase the drainage such that it wasn't standing in water. So I tell people, if you have drainage nowhere else on your soccer field, at least get water away from the field. If you can get surface flow on the field, if you look back at the previous slide, there's not water on the field. The water is on the sidelines, but this impacts the play of the game where the players are standing, etc. But once the water gets there, you need to get it away from the field, away from the stadium. So at least putting drainage around the outside is a great minimum. You know, here is a baseball field that had continual drainage problems. They came in and retrofitted and put some drain lines to get the water, you know, away from that field. And this is before the field has healed. Same situation here, just having water drainage around the outside would not be sufficient on this rather large baseball field. I mean, this was after a storm. They did cover the infield, but this is excess water. So this type of field would require obviously much more drainage. And this was a construction issue, and ultimately they had to rebuild this particular field. And sometimes it's not just construction, it's just management and the environment. I mean, this field, very low level of maintenance, standing water, poor drainage, it just was not going to perform at any level. So it needed to be renovated. So to maximize water movement, you know, you can put drainage across larger fields and then have a smaller crown. So whether it's a football field, American football, or soccer field, that would be more ideal, is to not only have the edge drainage, but have the drainage across the surface. And the example I have here is going back to a baseball field where they had a lot of infield issues. So they went ahead and put the drainage in later on after the field was built. And in many cases, this can be done in-house with your own employees, or in some cases you may contract out and have someone come in and do this during an off season when the field is not needed quite as frequently. But also managing all of your surfaces. You know, baseball, softball for us requires us to manage not only the natural grass, but also the clay surfaces. But regardless of what it is, having a good constructed field that's been laser leveled, that you really can get the surface water off the site, will go a long way towards maintaining the integrity of that field and prevent some of the wear and damage you might see. So whether it's a renovation of this field, it's a softball field, or a new construction, using good equipment, good techniques to build it, design it and build it correctly is very, very important for long-term use and maintenance of that facility. So you deal with irrigation, and I mentioned that as one of the cornerstones of a well-maintained field. You can certainly go to the extremes of not enough or too much. If you have not enough, certainly renovation and adding irrigation, but also even temporary measures with hose reels. And I mentioned wetting agents can help disperse what little water you have. It doesn't actually increase drainage, but it can disperse water. So you get a more thorough wetting. Can go a long way towards dealing with that lack of irrigation. And certainly too much, in many cases, you may not be able to do anything but wait for the drains. And in some cases, you can also use smart irrigation technology. I know Dr. Graybo is going to give a talk at your conference. I've worked with Dr. Graybo for many years on irrigation issues. And I'm sure he will share with you some very good ideas on some sensors and shut-off devices to incorporate into your irrigation management. So just a couple of pictures. We see instances like this, in many cases when our irrigation coverage is not very good, so it wasn't very well designed, and we don't get good distribution. And this was a field, the day I was there, they were actually irrigating, but those stripes across the field were mud coming up on the mower tires earlier that day when they had mown the outfield of this particular field. So it did not need additional water, and they were still irrigating it this particular day. So that's going to take some management on your part or using technology to help you. And it's certainly important to fix problems before they get too big, whether it's drainage, irrigation, whatever that instance may be. This particular field I was going to that day, when I drove up, I could see the water coming out of the ground. So they had a busted quick coupler, and in short order, it had totally removed the pitching mound on this baseball field. So let's circle back around and talk a little bit about grass species and cultivar. And this is a very busy slide, so I don't really, you don't need to know a lot about it, but I wanted to take a little bit of an opportunity to talk to you about differences in cultivars. And we have a turfgrass evaluation program within the United States where we evaluate every 5 years new grasses along with industry standards. And this is part of our National Turfgrass Evaluation Program. And I highlighted some common cultivars of Bermudagrass that we often use. And I did highlight Tifway, and these are in order of this last column. So the bigger the number, the higher the quality. So the mean up here, 6.2 for Tiftuff, is obviously much better than New Mexico Sahara, which is a common type, a seeded type of 3.2. So you want to be at the top end of the scale. But if you look, Tiftuff and Latitude 36 are for us new grasses. They have been named, they've been on the market a few years. They offer a much improved surface over the industry standard Tifway. Riviera is a seeded type. So we do see seeded types of Bermudagrass having quality in many cases similar to our vegetative types. So I like to point that out because sometimes I hear people say, I can't afford to sod or to sprig, but I can purchase seed. They certainly look at data available to you of what would be an improved seeded Bermudagrass and start off with the best seed you can, to get the best grass you can. And this data is fairly widely available. You can contact a lot of researchers in the US that do in-depth studies, or look at the in-depth website and start looking at what grasses you have available, to you. The other thing, which I apologize, I don't know if you all overseed very much. We don't use overseed as much as we used to, but applying a ryegrass onto a Bermudagrass will certainly increase the wearability of that surface. So if you look at the orange bars are with perennial rye and the white bars are without perennial rye, the number of games before you reduce coverage is usually pretty substantial. You know, here's 13 games to 20 games, 7 extra games of wear and tear. And I would say the kind of wear put on this study was pretty aggressive. But you can benefit yourself. But there's also differences in different cultivars. In this particular case, Tifway was, more wear tolerant than Patriot, etc. So it does make a difference in cultivar and also how you oversee that cultivar. The other thing you probably want to stay away from, and I took this picture visiting a baseball field a number of years ago, is they had introduced a newer cultivar into an existing field, and it was a repair area. But you can see cultivars have different traits, different characteristics. And to me, that's not very attractive to introduce this very dark green grass into what was traditionally a medium green field. So be very cautious of how you introduce cultivars. In many cases, you're going to want to introduce, larger areas if you are going to change out, part of your field in a new turf grass. And then sometimes I'll visit fields, they want to blame the grass, and you'll understand this picture more with the next picture, but this was in the middle of the field and this was the end zone. And the comment I heard from the facility was, the field didn't hold up because the grass doesn't hold up. I pointed out that the end zone, where obviously the players were not reaching the end zone very frequently in the American football game, actually looked pretty good. It was in the winter time, so it was partially dormant, but it was really the wear of the field causing an issue, and the field was very wet. And this is the actual field. And it's interesting to point out, this is the coach, this is me, and these are 2 school administrators. And you see one with a coat on, a coat and a tie, and nice dress shoes. He did not want to walk across the field and get his dress shoes wet. But he was the person we needed to convince, because he was going to write the check to make some improvements to the field. So it's very good to have communication when there are field problems with the people who are involved. In many cases, I actually like the coach to be out front, not in the back, to help also discuss issues he has with the field. But ultimately, the decision was made to change out the grass on this field. So that's a great segue into just some other miscellaneous things to bring up. And the first one I wanted to bring up was evaluation of your fields. Develop some type of mechanism by which you can judge your fields and record it. This is very important as you're trying to track how much use your field is getting and the condition it may be in. That will help you make changes and help talk to your people that may invest the money in the field and making renovations as appropriate. And also it can help maybe prevent a next time. If you know there's issues and you can document it, maybe next time you will not get to that situation to begin with. There's a number of resources available to our field managers. You can make your own, but this is one that our Sports Turf Managers Association developed years ago. These can be downloaded from their national website, but it's basically allows you to go out on a field and make observations and document the conditions. So this is just basically a field safety and maintenance checklist. So you do this periodically, once a month, once every few weeks, and it will help you sit down with those decision makers about your field and what you might do to keep it safe, keep it playable for the number of athletes who will be using it. So I mentioned this early on. I wanted to circle back around to it. We've had a number of facilities in the United States that I've worked with that have multiple fields. They may be in one location, such a park setting where they have 5, 6, 7 fields, or it may be a town that has fields all the way around their town areas. But one of the things that we have found to be very successful is they designate these fields as certain categories. And I'll give you two examples here. One of them that the local town uses is championship, tournament, or recreational. You may use something a little bit more general, like a game field, a practice field, and a recreation field. But what the local groups have done in many cases is they develop standards for these three categories. And you could have fewer or more categories. And they say, we'll guarantee total turf coverage on our championship field. But to do that, we need to spend a little extra money. We need to have a fence around it so we can control where. And we also need to be able to make decisions on closing it or opening it based on its condition. So what we're basically saying is our highest level of management, we will guarantee if you'll give us a little more money and a little more control. Our tournament fields, we're not going to maintain at the same level. We're going to maintain them at a high level, but not quite as high, but we're going to put less money into them. Our recreational fields would be just that. These will fields that will get minimum maintenance, minimum inputs, but we're not going to maybe guarantee their condition for the whole year, the whole season. And what this does is basically it sets the expectation bar appropriately to your coaches, your athletes, and user groups. They're going to want to use a tournament or championship field. But they also realize that to have that level of quality is going to take more from you or whoever's paying the bills to keep it at that condition. In many cases, what it also does is allows you to illustrate to the user groups, if you give me enough money and labor, this is what I can do. If you want to turn a recreational field into a tournament or a tournament to a champion, we can do that, but it requires you to assist us in getting there. And this has been a very effective way, once again, dealing with the people issue along with the agronomic issue, bringing them together for those decision-making processes. So that was something I would encourage you to try and see if that would work in your situations. So one of the things they do in this situation certainly is developing a basic budget and then for each category having their own unique budgets. So you're projecting costs, you're setting priorities, and you're allocating spending to produce that desired and realistic result. So if you can develop a system where you can do this, like I said, if you have multiple fields, you can do this. If you're at a situation where you only have one field or maybe two fields, this would be much, much more challenging. But certainly it's something for you to consider and to think about. And certainly, as you look at this field, and this is a tournament level field, excuse me, a championship level field locally at one of our soccer parks. They have 8 fields on this facility. 3 of them are designated as a championship level, and then they have, I think, 4 or 5 that are designated as tournament level, and then a couple that are recreational level. But you can see the quality of this field. And because it's such a high quality, there's a lot of tournaments that bring in revenue for the community that are brought into this facility. And this was one of our collegiate women's soccer tournament championships several years back. So it goes back to certainly water management, your maintenance, and your limited use, also built around that proper design and construction. So if you can put all of those together, you can have great championship level fields. But if you can't put those together, it doesn't mean you still can't have good services for your athletes. So with that, before I stop sharing my screen, my email address, if you would ever like to contact me and have questions, certainly I'm open to that. This is our football field once again. And once again, it's my first name and last name with an underscore. And that then kind of concludes. I have not been monitoring chat. Let's see. It looks like the chat was just to everyone. So John, I'm not sure if you want to, how you're doing the questions or chat times, but I'm certainly open to questions. I think I have about 10 more minutes or so for questions.